He got his PhD at the London School of Economics, and he teaches at Texas Tech. Please welcome Vincent, and I don't want to mess up your last name.
Geloso, Vincent Geloso.
Vincent Geloso.
I don't teach, I'm just a postdoc at Texas Tech, but it's a great place to be.
You wrote a paper on the hidden costs of the drug war.
Yes, it was kind of an accident on this front. We started as a project to respond to professors' work on inequality. And the guy's point on inequality was inequality creates distrust. Distrust creates a need to supervise others. So we spend more resources on security. And his argument was that that was the cost of inequality. There was more inequality, hence we needed more security guards. And that was the big cost of it. And when we were noticing at his data, what we were noticing is that the places with high inequality were also places where the war on drug was aggressively racked up, in a sense that it was where most enforcement efforts were allocated. So in these areas like New York, California, in all of these areas, you would find heavy levels of prohibition enforcement. And this would create the same effect, he says, because in the process, so you have illegal markets, you have fewer police officers available to police other crimes. So it creates a more insecure environment. So you would also need to hire security guards. But as we progressed into this complementary explanation, we noticed that there was actually a lot of hidden costs this was actually a hidden cost of the war on drugs. A lot of the time when people discuss the war on drugs, they will discuss cost to consumers, and very rarely will they talk about some ripples from the war itself. It will rarely talk about these ripple costs. One of them would be the fact that it creates insecurity, and we need to hire more security guards just to make sure we're feeling safe. And that's a cost on society. We're forced to hire more people, more guns, private ones, to protect ourselves. And that was actually a very conservative estimate because we didn't include the other things that come from greater insecurity, which would be more spending on alarms, more spending on low jacks to protect your cars.
And from an economic standpoint, that is definitely a higher cost. Did you ever think about this from a more psychological point of view or a solution based? What, in your opinion, would be the solution to reducing the amount of money we spend?
I want to emphasize that our results are it was limited to a first paper we did, and it wasn't as big as, it's not as good as we want it to be. It's a conservative measure of things. So I want to downplay our result. And even if I downplay it, it's still big. So we're saying that just a one standard deviation in the number of dollars we spend in the war on drugs, just so it's not a massive amount. We're talking roughly $50 less spending per capita in the United States at the state level. And it generates a massive effect by which you would reduce the security guard labor force by 100,000 just from one standard deviation. It's roughly 10% of the 1 million security guards in the United States. It's a very large cost imposed. And I wouldn't really want to stress, this is me being conservative. I haven't tried more things. Our data is time series limitation. It's not as good as we want it to be. And since we framed it as a paper in response to an inequality paper, it wasn't our main focus on that, but we realized we wanted to do something, because even if I make all these caveats and disclaimers about how much I don't like the data as it is right now, the effect is still big. We're talking about a massive hidden cost. The virtue of pointing out this hidden cost is the fact that in the war on drugs, people will often mention all the possible hidden costs from liberalization. It will mention more problems related to mental diseases, to increased criminality in some areas, more drug overdose or situations like that. But they never emphasize the hidden costs of the war on drugs. So they're saying, oh, there's all these problems coming from liberalization, but we fail to emphasize the costs that we don't see from the war on drugs itself. And pointing this out starts to put the perspective into the greater debate, and just this, and keep piling on the security problem.
From an economic standpoint, that's a very valuable data to have, because one of the most common arguments against rehabilitation is it's too costly. It's too costly to rehabilitate these people.
So one of the arguments that's really advanced frequently is really like the fact that there's all these other costs to legalization. And I'm personally in favor of legalization, or at the very least decriminalization. But they emphasize all these costs. So they'll say like there will be more people with mental diseases, more forms of crime, more overdoses. But they never emphasize these hidden costs. These hidden costs being that there's more violence. We have to spend more resources on protecting ourselves. That there is actually a cost to crime personally. So when we endure crime, this is more frequently mentioned as one of the second order effect of the war on drugs. So when we're victims of crime, it's a cost to ourselves. But we also respond to the war on drugs by trying to protect ourselves. We don't want to get shot, but we do hire people to protect us. We do hire the services of the alarm industry, or buy ourselves a weapon to protect ourselves. Guns are not a cause of crime. Crimes are a cause of guns in a situation like that. So people respond in that way, but this is a cost. This is a cost in the sense that we're expending more resources to respond to the fact that the government has been trying to prohibit drugs. And by trying to do that, it reduces the availability of police resources on other crimes. So it's spreading things more thinly. But it also leads to a weird effect where in the process of the war on drugs, some people try to, on the illegal markets, when they have conflicts and they believe there's a breach of contracts, they will use violence to solve a problem. And then these forms of violence will spill over into the rest of society. And these organizations will then impose a cost on society when we try to respond. So we're talking about second order and third order effects from the war on drugs. But these are considerable costs. Just think of like the point I've been making. We're talking about 100,000 security guards extra that we would normally have just if there was $50 spent less on a per capita basis. We're liberating tons of resources for other purposes. It's a massive benefit. It's a massive cost that we're imposing ourselves related to the war on drugs.
So it basically has a ripple effect on society in the sense that it's not just affecting the people, the drug users, it's affecting everybody in their neighborhoods, it's affecting the prison system, it's affecting...
Yes, that's a perfect summary. It's a very excellent summary of the point. And these ripple effects are much more dynamic than we realize. One example is the work of David Scarbeck on the hidden order of the underworld. So how prison gangs create order in prisons. So they use social capital to create associations, but these have negative spillover. So they're criminals creating bands to generate some form of order to protect themselves from the violence related to illegal activities. But this creates some spillovers into other spheres of societies. Just think about like the argument that people have been advancing that Black communities feel marginalized by the police. But the other group, that is the illegal group, enforces disobedience to institution. It means that some people don't feel trust in public institutions. That would explain a lot of the distrust that the Black community has towards government institutions. It would explain it by the fact that the government is creating a vicious circle by which when some groups try to respond, they create spillovers in the way people behave in societies in further rounds. And these are whole costs that people fail to point out and that are never mentioned. And we're talking like second order, third order, fourth order effects, but they're never mentioned in the question of should we continue the war on drugs. Everybody will mention the cost from liberalization, that it will be from mental diseases, from overdoses, from what they believe to be greater levels of consumption. But they never mention all these other costs that we have right now from prohibition.
For everybody that doesn't know, you're the one that compiled all this data yourself with a group of other people. You're the one who's been really leading the research on this.
So yes, me and my co-author, what we did is we took the number of guards relative to the population in every state, and we took the only available measure of the intensity of drug prohibition enforcement. We didn't include like other illegal markets from prostitution to... because it applies to all forms of prohibition, but just the war on drug would be one example. And we took the level of government spending per state on each of these, and then we tested other things being held constant. How much more security guards do you need relative to the population, given the level of enforcement? And we find that a one standard deviation in the level of enforcement is equal to 100,000 more security guards in the U.S. overall. So if all states were to drop their enforcement by their deviation, that's a massive cost. We're talking 100,000 workers. That's the cost of none of really bad policies. And we're just talking from the war on drugs. And it's a conservative estimate because we're not including the other costs on security that you have, which would be, for example, more padlocks, more LoJacks, more expenses on security alarms, on video cameras, on all these other things that you would provide. We're taking like one measure. What's the cost, the hidden cost of us responding to the heightened insecurity related to the war on drugs?
You mentioned earlier about African American communities might feel alienated or not safe with police officers. And I relate as just a citizen who's never even gotten in that much trouble with the police. But usually when I see a police officer, my first thought is there a headlight on my car that's off that I'm going to get in trouble.
Yeah, it's actually a very good example. Imagine it this way. Like, let's do like a sequence of event. At the time of enforcement, so we passed a law on prohibition. Let's just imagine, like, to stylize the fact. We passed prohibition on drugs, and we decide, okay, now it's not going to be sold. Well, illegal markets are generally attractive to marginal communities. Which community is most marginal in the United States? African Americans are at the margin. They're poorer on average. So they'll get engaged in that. If there's at that point any stereotype regarding this community, police officers will tend to believe, oh, so if we have to enforce this and we have the stereotype that African Americans sell drugs, and it doesn't have to be a valid stereotype, it will just create a cycle to which you reinforce it. But then when the African community sees that there is more enforcements toward them, they will respond by trusting police officers less. And in turn, police officers will heighten their efforts to enforce, which will then lead to further deterioration, trust towards the police. So it's kind of creating vicious circles. When I was talking about third order and fourth order effects, this is actually a good example of this. Even though people don't have bad faith, you don't need to have people of bad faith in this argument. People can be entirely of good faith, but because you're creating an incentive system that is reinforcing bad behavior, that is reinforcing bad beliefs in that situation. And that's a cost. That's a form of cost. It means that the efficiency of policing drop time of this. So it's not only that we have to spend more on policing ourselves. So African Americans will respond in one of the rounds by carrying more guns or protecting themselves or trying to hire the services of people who will protect them in one way or another. This leads to rounds of deteriorations in the quality of life for all groups because it heightens the risk to police officers, it heightens the cost that the African American community bears. Fact of perverse incentive caused by the war on drugs, but it's a cost. It's a cost that people rarely underline. And the more you think about these second order and third order and fourth order effects, the greater they become, the more important and more relevant they become in this debate. And the more we have to weigh them, the more we should become skeptical of attempts at enforcing the war on drug.
Yeah, how much violence has occurred because of the drug war? I wonder what the statistic is. I'm pretty sure it's staggering, like the statistic for the amount of African American people or just people in general that have been killed because of police brutality from drug-related arrests.
From a psychological perspective, the means by which we tend to deal with the problem escalates it. And at your end, even it's the economics, like everything is working against progress.
Yes. So as part of the psychological costs, there is this point that people also fail to emphasize is that if people feel like, just from a psychological perspective, if people feel insecure, because we'll just think about the first order effect being police officers are now having to spread themselves more thinly over some resources. People will feel psychologically that they're less secure. One of their reaction would be in that case to spend more on security or live in gated communities and engage less with other people. But gated communities, hiring a gun, buying an alarm company's services is a form of cost from the war on drugs. It's second order effect. One of the more important order effects would be after that, after there's all these reactions. There's also the fact that the illegal markets create illegal markets for educating conflict. So not only is police resources being spread too thin, but drug criminals, so people who are trying to sell drugs, they need law and order the same way we do. You need the police behavior in some way, so you need institutions. but the institutions they have become private governance institution and the kind that rely more on violence. So in a very more rude way than I've been saying is if you disagree with someone over contracts, you can't go to court, you shoot the guy. But then that can lead to accidental drive-bys where people get shot accidentally. It leads to extreme acts of violence that can then spill over on innocent bystanders. And this is what strikes me, is that people have actually a knowledge of this when you think about the war for alcohol prohibition. People know this history. Americans know it by heart. They know that during the 1920s, there was a massive increase in crime, and Americans responded. They responded by they paid the price into being more often than in the past innocent bystanders, accidental victims from battles between different criminal organizations. But they would also spend much more resources protecting themselves from possible spillovers from the effects of the alcohol prohibition on crime. And Americans know this, and they know that the war on alcohol prohibition was a complete failure, and it was costly to American society because of that. It's the same logic that applies to the war on drugs, and there's a massive literature. If you read journals in economic history, you'll find a massive literature on these costs from alcohol prohibition that are second order and third order and fourth order effect, and if you import them to the war on drugs, they actually are relevant.
Yeah, people acknowledge the fact that alcohol prohibition did not work, which is very odd to me considering the drug war. But also, there's two ways that people tend to think. There's a more conservative view and a more liberal view. And liberals tend to be more open-minded and not follow authority. They're less trustful, and conservatives tend to be more trusting and follow whatever authority says. So from the conservative mindset, legalization of them is like saying everybody should do drugs because it's an authority saying it's okay.
Yeah, and it just seems like politicians from both sides of the aisle don't even want to talk about legalization of drugs, the fact that there's violence occurring because of this. And this is like an epidemic that we have of violence because of the war on drugs. And nobody in politics, and as far as like who's in Washington that I can think of, is talking about legalization. I mean, there's so much data that just topples over each other.
Experts such as Vincent and economists, they're looking at the data, but people aren't looking at the data. They're looking at what it means when you say legalize drugs. And to them, it means, oh, my kid's going to do drugs because they legalized it.
Yeah. So disclaimer, I'm personally very pro legalization, but I see the original steps. And the point I'm trying to make here is that in this debate, you can have value. You can believe that drugs are wrong. I actually don't believe you should consume them. I just don't believe that my personal values will actually make something better. I mean, to impose my personal set of values regarding drugs will probably lead to the costs I'm mentioning, which I believe to be important. But in policy design, that's what matters. So if we want to think about the war on drugs, you guys are absolutely right. People see it as an issue of values. If you really care about values, consider all these little parcels of cost that we're imposing that reduces the quality of life of others in ways that are hard to measure, but in a certain way are considerable and colossal. Just the idea that the extra security that we have to expend is equal to $100,000, 100,000 workers. Imagine that in terms of expenditures. We're talking about close to $100 billion in terms of long-term benefits once you get the net present value. So the permanent gains to the economy once you divide this by the discount rate. It's a massive benefit to the American economy that could come just from that, and it's a conservative measure. But all these dollars could be stuff spent on better education, on alternative stuff. There's an opportunity cost. We're expending these resources. They have an opportunity cost. If we didn't have to spend them, we could allocate them to better alternatives. That could include education. That could include better health care. That could include better nutrition, and there would be all these other little problems that would be reduced. If you think in terms of human values, this is a better way to think. And the better way to conceive about policy is to think about marginal steps. I'm saying the intensity of the war on drugs, even though I want liberalization, is the biggest problem. The more you ramp it down, you can get some of the marginal gains from legalization, even though you wouldn't legalize. So, for example, reducing mandatory minimum sentences, eliminating mandatory minimum sentences, you reduce them, or you reduce some types of drug consumption to misdemeanor offenses rather than being felonies. You try to go for more moderate enforcement where rather than having a task force for every city, you get a few police officers condemning the most egregious cases of drug abuse in public. It's not even, I'm not saying that that's what I think is the best thing possible, but in terms of marginal increments towards something better, which I think the best being, at the very least, decriminalization, and the ultimate best being legalization. But all these little steps along the way should not be forsaken because they could lead to considerable benefits to the wider society. So from eliminating mandatory minimum sentences to lesser levels of enforcement or different exigencies on police departments, all of these could lead to a reduction in the cost related to the war on drugs.
When you talk about how it would have such an economic impact for the positive, you can look at states that have legalized marijuana and how they've had an economic boom. Colorado, for example, now have like a surplus of money, a huge, massive surplus of money from all the tax revenue they've gained from marijuana, and then other states as well. There's massive effects in these states for the legalization. I don't know how much more proof we need that legalization is more beneficial.
By legalizing drugs, we'll be taking the economic steps needed in order to start programs to stop people from taking drugs. It's that ironic.
We know from the history of food, from the history of a ton of things. So my main field of interest is economic history. And it's by accident I'm stepping into this. And we know, like, for example, just the emergence of brands. For most of history, we had a problem with adulterated food, low-quality food. As the 19th century progressed, people started doing brands. So you'd have Armour Foods or XYZ company who would invest in a good reputation for a high quality product. And people consumed them because they were assured of a great quality service. Same thing happened for alcohol. Why do we have beer brands? Because we want to have something we're sure is good value. Okay, so brands is basically is a quality insurance. You know what the quality is. But for that, you need to have some property rights. Tomorrow morning, if McDonald's sells its entire thing, just the logo is worth something because it has a reputation. But it's a right. It's a property. Your reputation is a form of property. In a case of an illegal market, you can get stolen any day. There is no way to go to court if somebody infringes on your intellectual property. So what will you do? You won't invest in this. So you won't have brands on illegal markets. And you'll have problems of uncertainty towards quality. So it's actually quite hard to get your hands on high quality drugs, given the fact that it's illegal, because there is no incentive to invest in something that is of high quality. There is no incentive to create certain brands of drugs that are safer, that consumers will flock to, the same way that people on travel go to McDonald's because they feel they will get safe eatings because they're on travel. So the case for legalization, or at least anything that moves towards on a spectrum of policy towards legalization, the easiest case to make is for consumers, and it's already a large benefit. But what I'm saying is that this probably is dwarfed by all these other things that I'm pointing out in terms of how to do policy, these other costs that relate to our response to security needs and security and stuff like that.
As you were talking about how there's nobody who's going to invest in an illegal product, of course. If it was legalized, I liked your point when you were talking about how people would strive to make a safer product rather than getting an illegal product, and it's much more dangerous because they don't know what they're getting. Could be laced with something.
Yeah, exactly.
You never know. Yeah.
It's a pretty clean cut. To say that consumers will gain in terms of security, in terms of greater quality, in terms of prices, it's pretty clear. Legalization will have this effect. But this is dwarfed, in my opinion, by the other costs we would be eliminating. In terms of best case, so what we're considering, me and my colleague, in terms of to push the research, is to either use Colorado and see what happened when Colorado went to a kind of a weird, because it's not exactly legalization, but it is a form of, so it is decriminalization in a certain way. It's not complete, it's not across the board, it's not exactly as I like it. But it's been happening, what now? We're in year 3, 4, I think, of that experiment. I don't know, time flies by. But if you can do what we call in econometrics synthetic controls, so you take all the states and you see what's happening in all of them. and you see what would have happened. You create a counterfactual scenario of what the level of guards would have been like in Colorado had it not been for decriminalization. You would see, for example, that X number of more of guards in service than it has right now. That's one way of doing it. The other way of doing it is taking the case of Portugal, which is probably the best case example of decriminalization.
Yes.
Portugal went down a route that very few people discuss. They went for decriminalization with some support for drug consumers, so they'll have safe injection sites that are funded by the government. Not sure I'm a big fan of those, but the first part, decriminalization, is a good thing. And what's happening is in terms of consumption, it's actually remains stable in Portugal over time, even though it has skyrocketed everywhere in Europe. Everywhere in Europe it has increased except in Portugal. So it seems to have been able to buck the trend through decriminalization. And Portugal also has, in spite of that, also reduction in crime-related and drug-related crimes. So fewer overdoses, also fewer crimes related to spillovers from the drug market. So it is a clear benefit. And if people can exploit these experiments of Colorado and Portugal, I think it will come into light that the benefits to consumers would be small in comparisons from all of these other benefits related to anything that would ramp down the enforcement of drug prohibition.
I like that you brought up Portugal, and Portugal is the best example for your case. And I mean, we all agree with you here, but have you heard from opposing viewpoints, and what have they said?
So I'm engaged with some drug policy analysts, and in the discussion we've had, the consensus that seems to emerge is that no one thinks it's a bad thing. What they'll say is how much of a good thing it is. So that's hardly a negative debate, saying, oh, it was a good thing, but we don't know how much. I'm convinced that it was actually quite good. They'll say no, because the government didn't spend as much on safe injections and safe injection sites, and not as much on awareness as it should to reduce consumption, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the debate is not in the window if it was good or not. It's in the window of how good it was, how much better it could have been, and that's it. That's the debate between drug policy experts. You'll have some of the most conservative will say, it didn't do that much good. You will have a hard time finding someone who said, that went south super fast. No, the consensus is there was some benefits, at the very least minimals.
Generally, I tend to see a lot of studies that are a year or 6 months, and I'm not sure how accurate they are just because of spikes of activity due to policy change. Whereas with Portugal, they had 10 years worth of data, so it just seemed a lot more trustworthy.
Liberalization started 2001 in Portugal, I think 2002 or 2001. Keep forgetting the year. But we're talking right now, we're going on 15 years strong, at the very least. That's a long time for an experiment, it's kind of time. So that's why we're exploring the possibility of using Portugal to get through the methods of econometrics of synthetic control to see what Portugal would have looked like had it continued with the policy of drug prohibition. And that's the idea, because it's the only one that bucked the trend, that went away from prohibition. That's like where we're taking our research. But it is an important point, because what I keep saying it and I keep repeating it, but it is crucial that people start sinking this in their heads. The biggest costs from the war on drugs probably don't come from the costs consumers bear directly. They come from costs that even non-consumers bear in indirect fashions.
I completely agree. Who have you found benefits from this war on drugs? What are the lobbies that come to mind, or people in general that come to mind that would want this to still be legalized?
Here's where I am unwilling to provide a response, because it's hard to understand. I've seen different theories around of why the policy continues, and it's hard to find an answer that I find convincing. The one that I find that I'm the most sympathetic to is that the voters who are in favor of the war on drugs are generally people who have very little information about this. They assume very little costs directly from this, of which they are aware, and they have no incentives to be informed about the costs. Probably they have bigger costs than they know, but they don't see them. They don't see these costs, and they're not aware of them. They don't have any incentives to be informed of these. So politicians who respond rationally to voter pressures don't want to sacrifice this. So they're responding in a very rational way to the political market. That's the explanation I find the most convincing. But It doesn't explain, for example, some features of policies like why do we have mandatory minimums? Why do we have all these extras on prohibition in the way it's being done? And that's where I have a hard time providing a strong explanation for why the policy is being done. And right now, a lot of people see all these negative costs, all these costs from liberalization and legalization, and they don't see the cost from their own position of criminalization, prohibition. The wildest estimates of costs from legalization, they are dwarfed by the costs that we are imposing ourselves from the second order and third order effects from the war on drugs, plus the cost that consumers bear directly. It is a net cost to society as a whole in very obvious ways and in much less obvious ways, even to non-consumers.
The mandatory minimum laws originally was attempting to get dealers that were higher up. But then what I don't understand is when they found out that the law wasn't working the way they intended it, they never changed it. They just left it the same.
So the last part of your reply, because as I was listening to the first part of what you were saying, I was going to say, I'm a public choice guy. I've been trained in the public choice tradition of economics. And my general thing when politicians tell me reasons, I'm like, this was probably your post facto justification in the same way that some laws are justified with creative explanations drawn from some theory many years after the facts. So I never buy it. But by saying the second part of your reply, which is that, once they discovered it didn't work, why didn't they end it? Well, you've just made the point I was going to make, which is, why are you keeping this bad policy? It's a hard thing to explain. Why are you keeping it once you know it's done? Probably it has to do more with political markets.
What's your conclusion of what we should do from this moment on to help people learn about the benefits of legalization and their pros and cons and why they should go for legalization?
Okay, so I've said it. My disclaimer is I prefer anything that moves towards legalization. But I understand why some people are reluctant towards it. I get the point. It's not. I've seen the cases of drug abuse. It's not fun. Don't downplay them. Upplay what actually matters down the line, because it's Bastia's story of the seen and the unseen. The drug abuse is the seen, right? So that's what people see when they think of the policy, and that would be the cost of liberalization. And they don't see the benefits that would come from legalization, and we have to upplay these benefits that would come on the side. The fact that we wouldn't have to so we're breaking a window by spending so much resources on enforcement and violence, and it's resources we can't use to better feed kids, to fight to promote drugs awareness, to promote education, to I don't know. Even if you're not a libertarian, then you like the idea of ending the war on drugs. Well, it's less money you have to fight in the war against poverty. It's less resource. It's a broken window. We're breaking a window, and we have to spend resources rebuilding something. While we could be spending those resources doing other things. And in the debate, what should be upplayed is this. Don't downplay like the bad sides of drugs. Just upplay every benefit that we might have, because they don't really need to be upplayed. In reality, they're pretty big, but emphasize them.
All right, so upplay the economic advantages of legalization. All right, I think that's all the time we have about now, but I would like to thank Vincent very much for coming on the show and explaining all of this data that he gathered for us. Is there anything you want to plug or anything you want to say before we end this?
This is a research agenda that I stumbled on by accident, and I expect to keep milking this for a few years. So
the more data you find, please, you're always welcome on the podcast. This is something that I'm very interested in. I feel very passionate about, and I think you're doing great work.
Thank you very much, and I'd love to be back.
Awesome.
It was a pleasure, guys.
All right.
Thank you for watching SFL On Air. You can support our Patreon page by clicking to the left, or watch another video by clicking to the right. Also, click the middle channel icon to subscribe.